At 8:41 a.m., Mara Whitfield stepped into the elevator, with three coworkers standing less than an arm's length away. Yet no one nodded, no one made eye contact, as if she were nothing more than empty air between tailored jackets and polished shoes. She had been ignored before. She had been underestimated before. But this felt different. At 8:42 a.m., when the elevator doors closed and no one pressed the button for her floor, Mara realized something that sent a quiet chill down her spine. They weren't angry with her. They weren't trying to push her out. They simply didn't see her anymore. At 9:02 a.m., she sat down at her desk and opened the internal system. Her screen loaded, her email synced, her hands rested on the keyboard, but her status did not appear online. And in that moment, Mara Whitfield understood something most employees never do. The most ruthless form of workplace revenge doesn't require confrontation. Mara had worked at Helix Row Analytics for nearly 7 years, long enough to understand that the company wasn't run by people. It was run by predictions. At 7:18 a.m., earlier that morning, she had placed her coffee on the kitchen counter of her small North Side apartment as her phone vibrated with a familiar alert. Daily performance. Forecast ready. Helix Row didn't ask how employees felt. It didn't care about motivation or burnout. It only cared about projected output. Mara scrolled through the metrics with practiced ease. Response speed, task resolution probability, communication efficiency, variance. All green, except for one line at the bottom, faded and gray. Social presence index, declining. She paused for half a second, then locked her phone. A soft metric, non-essential. At least, that's what they claimed. At 10:26 a.m., inside a glass-walled conference room on the 12th floor, Mara presented her findings on a data distortion affecting Midwest inventory projections. Her voice was steady. Her data was precise. Every claim was backed by numbers. When she finished, the room stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then her manager, Daniel Rourke, nodded and turned to the person beside him. "So what do you think about this direction?" No one looked at Mara. No one challenged her analysis. No one acknowledged that she had spoken at all. At 11:04 a.m., the meeting summary email arrived. Key insights were shared by the team regarding Midwest discrepancies. No names. No attribution. Her work had been absorbed, without her. Mara didn't feel angry. She felt unsettled. Because no one had treated her poorly. No one had raised their voice. No one had crossed a line. They were erasing her politely. At 1:37 p.m., while waiting by the printer, the machine froze and displayed the list of recent users. Her name wasn't there, even though she had sent the job less than a minute earlier. She looked around the office. Laughter, conversations, movement, belonging. Everyone else still existed. Mara opened a system. Few employees dared to check. Predictive retention model. Her name was still listed, but the color had changed. From green to yellow. From stable to uncertain. And for the first time in 7 years, Mara Whitfield realized something terrifying. Helix Row didn't need to fire her. They were simply making her unnecessary. Mara didn't confront anyone. She didn't send emails. She didn't ask questions that could be logged. At 2:11 p.m., she stayed at her desk long after the open office noise softened into keyboard clicks and distant laughter, pretending to review dashboards while quietly opening a section of the system most analysts never touched. System logic trace. It wasn't meant for interpretation. It was meant for confirmation. Mara filtered the logs by user behavior correlation, then narrowed the window to the last 90 days. What appeared on her screen wasn't a list of mistakes. It was a pattern. At 2:29 p.m., she noticed a repeating marker embedded deep inside performance evaluations, invisible on the surface, but consistent beneath it. A silent flag. Not labeled. Not explained. Just a Boolean value that quietly shifted outcomes. Employees marked with it didn't get warnings. They didn't receive bad reviews. They slowly lost gravity. Their meeting invitations thinned. Their suggestions stopped being attributed. Their presence stopped affecting outcomes. At 3:02 p.m., Mara cross-referenced the flag with internal metrics and felt her breath slow. The variable wasn't tied to productivity. It wasn't tied to accuracy. It was tied to something Helix Row never admitted to measuring. Social return on investment. How often people echoed your ideas. how frequently others built on your suggestions, how likely you were to reinforce existing authority structures. Mara leaned back in her chair. She wasn't underperforming. She was insufficiently useful to the narrative. At 3:34 p.m., she pulled a list of flagged employees and scanned the names. Most had already left. Quiet resignations, new opportunities, personal reasons. One name, however, was still active. Hers. At 4:08 p.m., Daniel Rourke walked past her desk and stopped, as if remembering something he meant to say earlier. "Oh, Mara," he said, his tone casual. "Just a heads up, we're restructuring some workflows. Nothing you need to worry about." She smiled politely. "Of course," she replied. But she noticed something else. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask a follow-up. And he didn't wait for her answer. At 5:11 p.m., after most of the floor had emptied, Mara opened her calendar. 3 meetings scheduled for the next day had disappeared. No cancellations. No notifications. Just absence. That night, at 10:46 p.m., lying awake in the dark of her apartment, Mara stopped asking herself why this was happening. She asked a better question. Who benefits from silence? Because someone had decided that visibility was a resource, and they had decided she no longer deserved it. What they didn't realize was this. Mara Whitfield didn't need to be seen to understand the system watching her. Mara didn't rush. People who rush inside systems like Helix Row leave footprints. At 8:06 a.m. the following morning, she arrived earlier than usual, when the office lights were still adjusting, and the building felt more like a machine warming up than a place meant for people. She opened a private workspace and created something small. A mirror. At 8:19 a.m., she began building a comparison model, not to prove she was being treated unfairly, but to understand who wasn't. Control groups told the truth that performance reviews never did. She filtered employees by role, tenure, and output variance, then aligned them against promotion, velocity, and meeting visibility. The results appeared slowly, line by line, until the shape of the answer became impossible to ignore. There were people performing worse than her, consistently worse. Missed deadlines, incomplete analyses, sloppy assumptions, and yet their visibility remained intact. At 9:02 a.m., Mara highlighted the common thread. They were agreeable. They repeated leadership language. They validated decisions already made. They never introduced friction. They didn't challenge the system. They reinforced it. At 9:41 a.m., during a stand-up meeting she was no longer officially invited to, Mara listened from her desk as voices carried across the open floor. A junior analyst repeated a conclusion Mara had written weeks earlier. The room reacted. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. The idea finally had weight. Just not her name. Mara wrote one sentence in her notebook. This company doesn't reward intelligence. It rewards alignment. At 11:28 a.m., she ran one final test. She submitted 2 versions of the same insight through different channels. One under her name. One anonymously, routed through a senior manager's workflow. Only one triggered follow-up discussions. Only one appeared in the afternoon briefing. And only one was considered strategic. At 1:03 p.m., Mara closed the model and sat still. She wasn't invisible because she was weak. She was invisible because she was inconvenient. At 2:44 p.m., Daniel passed her desk again and smiled, this time longer. "Appreciate your flexibility lately," he said. She smiled back. "Of course." But inside, something had shifted. Mara finally understood the rule. If you couldn't be removed for poor performance, you could be removed for non-compliance. And if the system decided you were friction, then friction was what you had to become. Carefully. Precisely. On your own terms. Mara didn't fight the system. She fed it. At 6:52 a.m., before the city fully woke, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, not logged into Helix Row directly, but into a sandbox environment she had helped design years ago and never fully decommissioned. It wasn't a breach. It was an oversight. At 8:03 a.m., when the office began to populate and dashboards started refreshing across the building, the system ingested a new layer of data. Subtle, compliant, perfectly reasonable. Mara called it shadow input. Not false information. Not sabotage. Just context the system had never been trained to question. At 9:17 a.m., during the morning metrics sync, leaders noticed something unusual. Certain workflows were slowing, not failing, not breaking, just becoming inefficient. At 10:01 a.m., Daniel's team flagged a drop in cross-department response velocity. Nothing alarming, nothing that justified escalation. Yet, Mara watched quietly as the system did what it was designed to do. It searched for friction, and it found it. At 11:22 a.m., the algorithm adjusted visibility weights, reallocating attention away from those who created collaborative drag, the same people who had always been safe, the agreeable ones, the echoers, the repeaters. By 1:14 p.m., calendar conflicts began appearing across leadership schedules. Meetings ran long, decisions stalled, blame drifted sideways, never landing cleanly. No alarms sounded, but discomfort spread. At 2:36 p.m., Mara received her first unexpected message in weeks. "Hey, can you take a look at this?" A director who hadn't acknowledged her existence in months. She replied 15 minutes later. Calm. Helpful. Precise. She didn't attach conclusions. She attached questions. At 3:48 p.m., her name reappeared in a shared document. No announcement. No apology. Just quiet reinstatement. At 5:09 p.m., as the office thinned again, Mara reviewed the updated models. The system had adapted. It always did. But this time, it had learned something new. Alignment without insight created inefficiency. And inefficiency had a cost. That night, at 11:02 p.m., Mara closed her laptop and stared at the ceiling, not feeling victorious, not yet. Because this wasn't revenge. This was leverage. And leverage only mattered if you knew when to stop pulling. Mara wasn't surprised when the invitation came. At 8:27 a.m., a calendar block appeared on her screen, without context, without agenda, and without the courtesy of asking. Private discussion. Location. Executive floor. She accepted it without hesitation. At 9:03 a.m., Mara stepped off the elevator onto the 21st floor, a place she hadn't been invited to in over a year. The carpet was thicker. The air was quieter. Sound softened up here, as if dissent had been absorbed long before it reached the walls. Daniel Rourke was waiting with someone else. Not HR. Not legal. A woman Mara had only seen once before, always from a distance. Evelyn Cross. At 9:11 a.m., Evelyn gestured toward a chair and spoke first. "You've been difficult to model lately," she said, her voice calm, precise. Mara didn't respond. She waited. At 9:14 a.m., Evelyn continued. "Systems like ours depend on predictability. When someone understands them too well, unpredictability follows." Daniel shifted slightly, but said nothing. At 9:21 a.m., Mara finally spoke. "I didn't break anything." "No," Evelyn agreed. "You improved it." That was the truth they didn't like saying out loud. At 9:28 a.m., Evelyn slid a tablet across the table. A new role. Expanded access. Direct influence over optimization, layers no one else touched. The title didn't matter. The power did. "We'd like you to formalize what you've been doing," Evelyn said. From the inside. Mara scrolled slowly. The compensation was generous. The authority was real. And buried deep in the language was the cost. Silence. At 9:41 a.m., Mara looked up. "And the people already flagged?" she asked. Evelyn didn't answer right away. "They made choices," she said finally. "So will you." At 9:52 a.m., Mara leaned back. This was the offer. Not forgiveness. Not justice. Absorption. At 10:04 a.m., she stood. "I'll need time," she said. Evelyn smiled. Of course. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. At 10:46 a.m., Mara left the building and stepped into the street. The city loud and unfiltered around her. She understood the truth now. Helix Row didn't fear failure. They feared people who could leave with knowledge. And for the first time since becoming invisible, Mara realized something heavier than leverage. Choice. Mara didn't give them an answer. Not because she was undecided, but because decisions made too quickly inside Helix Row were always predictable. At 6:18 a.m., 2 days after the meeting on the executive floor, She sat alone in her apartment, the city still quiet, and opened a file she had never labeled. It wasn't a resignation letter. It wasn't a backup plan. It was a map. At 7:02 a.m., as she reviewed years of system architecture, Mara began separating what Helix Row owned from what it merely depended on. Code could be replaced, dashboards could be rebuilt, but trust pathways could not. At 8:14 a.m., she documented the informal bridges, the human workarounds the algorithm relied on, but never understood. The late-night validations, the off-channel confirmations, the quiet judgment calls people made when data alone wasn't enough. The system didn't see those, but it needed them. At 9:36 a.m., inside the office, Mara behaved exactly as expected. She joined meetings when invited. She answered questions when asked. She didn't push. She didn't resist. Compliance was camouflage. At 11:11 a.m., she forwarded a routine analysis to Evelyn Cross, exactly as requested. Clean, neutral, useful. Nothing in it suggested departure. At 1:22 p.m., Mara requested access to historical failure audits under the pretense of optimization review. Approval came within minutes. They trusted her again. At 3:07 p.m., she copied nothing. She memorized everything. Patterns, dependencies, fragilities. At 5:41 p.m., she closed her laptop and looked around the office one last time, not with resentment, but with clarity. Helix Row didn't collapse without people. It collapsed when people left together. That night, at 11:38 p.m., Mara sent a single message to 3 former employees whose names she recognized from the silent flag list. No explanation. No pitch. Just a question. Are you still interested in fixing what we were never allowed to name? 2 replied within an hour. The third replied at 12:04 a.m. Yes. Mara smiled for the first time in weeks, because exit strategies weren't about escape. They were about timing, and she had all the time the system thought she didn't. Nothing happened at first. At 8:02 a.m., Helix Row Analytics opened as usual. Lights came on, dashboards refreshed, coffee machines hummed, in quiet agreement. Systems were stable. Metrics were green. At 8:17 a.m., Evelyn Cross joined the executive sync and reviewed overnight performance. No alerts, no anomalies. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. At 9:01 a.m., a project lead asked a question that should have been easy to answer. There was a pause. Not because the data was missing, because no one knew who usually interpreted it. At 9:24 a.m., a client escalation came in from the Midwest region. The numbers were there. The context wasn't. Someone suggested waiting. Another suggested looping in a team that no longer existed. At 10:08 a.m., Daniel Rourke stood in a glass conference room, staring at a whiteboard that used to fill itself with momentum. Ideas stalled mid-sentence. Decisions circled without landing. No system failure had occurred, but something essential was gone. At 11:36 a.m., Evelyn opened a dashboard she rarely checked. Human dependency mapping. It showed nodes, connections, influence pathways. Several had faded. Not erased, just inactive. At 12:14 p.m., an internal message went out requesting support from former contributors. No one responded. At 1:42 p.m., productivity dipped for the first time in over 2 years. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to be noticed by investors. At 2:27 p.m., Evelyn finally understood. The system wasn't broken. It had been hollowed out. At 3:05 p.m., Mara Whitfield sat in a quiet co-working space across town, sunlight cutting clean lines across the table as she closed her laptop. 3 other people sat nearby. No titles. No hierarchy. Just shared clarity. They weren't building a replacement. They were building something Helix Row could never own. At 4:18 p.m., Mara silenced her phone and didn't look back. Because the most effective form of workplace revenge isn't destruction, it's departure. And Helix Row would continue operating, just without the people who made it matter. Lessons learned. Lesson 1. In modern workplaces, you are rarely pushed out loudly. You are phased out quietly. No confrontation. No warnings. Just fewer invitations, less visibility, and eventually, silence. If you wait until you are openly attacked, you are already late. Lesson 2. Performance keeps you employed. Alignment decides whether you are protected. Many systems don't reward truth, insight, or intelligence. They reward reinforcement. If your value threatens the narrative instead of supporting it, the system will not fight you. It will erase you politely. Lesson 3. The most dangerous employees are not the loud rebels, but the ones who understand the system better than it understands itself. Power doesn't come from titles. It comes from knowing dependencies, patterns, and human shortcuts no algorithm can replace. That kind of knowledge can't be fired. It can only be feared or absorbed. Lesson 4. When a system offers you power in exchange for silence, it is not rewarding you, it is containing you. Being invited inside is not always a promotion. Sometimes it's a cage with better lighting. True leverage is not how high you rise inside the system, but how freely you can leave it. Lesson 5. The cleanest form of workplace revenge is not destruction, it is departure with clarity. When the right people leave together, nothing breaks immediately, but everything important disappears. And the system keeps running, never fully understanding what it lost.